Hi, welcome to the One Up Health Understanding the Latest CMS Proposed Ruling webinar. I'm here with two of my colleagues today. I'm Joe Gagnon, CEO of One Up Health. I'm here with Eden. Eden, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, Eden Avraham-Katz. I'm the General Counsel here at One Up Health.
And hi, Don Rucker, Chief Strategy Officer at One Up Health and also former National Coordinator. So seeing a new rule on interoperability is an interesting thing, since was heavily involved in leading the Cures Act rulemaking that generated all of these APIs with some great teams of folks at ONC and CMS over the last 7 years now.
Wow.
So,
well, maybe Don will just sort of pick up a little bit on that. And I think that the audience is probably curious to understand, that this new rule, which is still under some, conversation, there's a purpose behind it. What would you say is the reason for the new regulations, and what should we expect?
yeah. I think the reason is ultimately pretty clear. The American public are unhappy with healthcare, and Congress has been on a constant stream to try to fix it. The Cures Act that got all of these APIs and the concept of open APIs popularized and mandated, along with information blocking. All of these, I think, are ongoing reactions. So it's not just one rule. It is a whole series of requirements. And if you had to put a word on all of the requirements, they're all about transparency. They're all about getting data out, computing on data, and having transparency for the whole system on that data. The rule itself is what's called a proposed rule under a law, that the Administrative Procedure Act, that has something called Notice of Public Rulemaking. So there's a proposed rule, public comment, and then the final rule is folks are sort of sorting out maybe the technical part of it. But it's really about changing the American healthcare system. That's what this is ultimately about. So that you think of it in that context, not on, here's, some APIs or something.
Which we'll talk about in a second here. As you think about making change in a massive system like healthcare, right? There's some structural changes and there's going to be some strategy changes, but CMS has sort of gotten into some great detail about like how to affect this change in the industry, because really, we all know interoperability is a good goal and we haven't really achieved it, but they defined 3 classes of APIs at this moment so that payers would then be able to interact better. You want to talk about those 3 classes of APIs, Don?
Yeah. So again, this is an ongoing journey. So initially, about 10 years ago, some of the initial ONC rules on meaningful use had, that you have to have a portal. But in this brave new world where we live on our cell phones, portals are not enough. You really have to have computable APIs. Congress realized that, and the one part of that, obviously one part is the provider side with EMRs. Yeah. The other part of it is the payer side. And this rule has some provider provisions in it, but this rule is really saying we've delegated our payers with the requirement to allocate care, to support care. And so how do we get the payer data to be more transparent? And what the payer to patient individual right of access stuff had been there since the 2020 CMS rule. And there was some initial work that Eden's going to talk about on payer to payer and that evolution. The big add here is really the payer to provider. And so each of those, as the audience thinks about it, each of those has a subtly different role. So payer to patient is really so you know about your care and you can shop your care, potentially. Payer to payer then is the payer has the broadest overview of care. You go between different providers. And so that is sort of the totality of care. Payer to provider, which is the new component, is really another attempt at value-based care, at care coordination, where they're saying that I, as a provider, and I'm an ER doc and on weekends, so I know about not having the medical data. Unfortunately, that's sort of has always been a challenge, but the providers are now going to have computable APIs so they can get data outside of their system. We can all get data in our system. We can't get it from outside. The payers are typically the only people. So that's, I think that's what's in the rule as a stated purpose for those three classes of APIs.
So Ed, Don took us through sort of this tactical level. It's hard maybe to make a little bit of sense. There seems to be a bit of overlap between some of these APIs, but there are some similarities. You want to just provide a little more of your perspective on that?
Sure. I think thinking about the similarities is a really helpful way to kind of align what we're doing here. I do want to caveat by saying that in the context of this question, I'm going to be really talking about the three classes of API Don referred to, which is the patient access, payer to payer, and the provider access APIs. So all three of them essentially overlap in the how and the who and the what. So the how being how data is exchanged through those APIs, all of them are leveraging FHIR. So that's actually an interesting update from what we're seeing from before. The other piece of this is the who. So all of the impacted payers who have to essentially comply with these requirements include now Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, CHIP, and then the QHPs as well. So all of that have to meet all three of these requirements, which again is a bit of a change from what we saw before. And the lastly, and I think most importantly in terms of the overlap, is the what. So, and that is the data that has to be exchanged. So there are four classes of data that need to be exchanged under these APIs. First being clinical data. So these are typically any data elements that align with USCDI version 1. Second piece of this will be the claims data. So this is any data concerning adjudicated claims, including the appeals processes tied to that. In the case of patient access, this also includes provider remittances and cost sharing. Those two data elements will not be included for payer-to-payer and provider access for reasons of patient privacy. And then the other two are the encounter data. So from encounter data from capitated providers. And lastly, the prior authorization data. So any active request or any request for prior authorization that had a last status change within a year, that information needs to be available. So that typically includes things like date of approval, status of request, date of denial if it is denied, and of course the reason for the denial. That's a new update as well. So this is kind of what we're talking about in terms of the broad scope of the information being shared, which obviously quite broad when you think about all those data elements together.
And it's interesting as you listen to this very tactical sort of direction that CMS is pushing the industry. And you think about certainly the people listening on this webinar are saying, well, I have to do that, but there really is benefit to doing this. This isn't just like I have to and I end up with, oh, I met the requirement, but rather I can enable a new way of working. And so this provider access API is one of those elements. It's not just this tactical implementation, but really strategic implications of that.
Totally, yeah. And what's really interesting about the provider access API, so starting with patient access and payer to payer, what you're seeing is an opt-in model. So what that means is for data to be exchanged, an individual has to go in and say, yes, please share my data. With the provider access API, what makes it more unique is that it's an opt-out model, meaning that data is exchanged unless an individual expressly requests that it isn't.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important nuance to see, because I think we can all agree that having to get individual consent tends to be a roadblock for data sharing. I think the other thing of this that makes it really interesting for me, especially being someone who looks at the law in the healthcare space, is that we're really seeing an intersection between these regulations and HIPAA. So HIPAA, obviously, with its TPO or treatment payment and operations purpose exception, allows covered entities to exchange information for treatment payment and operations purposes. It's permissible. Both with the CMS regulations and ONC's information blocking, actually, that's the first time we started seeing that. You're taking permissible uses and are actually mandating them to be required uses, which is a really interesting shift in the space, because I think a lot of covered entities are constantly balancing privacy restrictions in terms of state and federal privacy laws with the need to be interoperable. And I think we're starting to see that balance shift a little bit in the other direction with some of these interoperability regulations, which for me personally is really exciting to see.
Yeah, so maybe we'll actually facilitate movement of information for the benefit of those who we were protecting their information, but didn't really get any benefit from the totality of the available information, right? So
Exactly.
Totally. Yeah.
it's really, it's interesting, and we'll continue always to keep these conversations going with many more questions here. But I think as we think about this, this is the beginning of this really big shift that's going to happen.
Totally.
That has been building up, Don, like a tsunami of sorts that you started on many, many years ago. And one of the areas we all suffer, the interesting part of healthcare, right, is that we're both involved as participants on both levels, as a patient or for us working on the software side, but this prior auth as a provider, right, as this prior auth thing has really frustrated almost everyone in the industry. And so this is the first time where we might actually make some progress. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think's happened with prior auth?
Yeah, so prior auth is, there's a technical phrase called PIA. I'll leave it to the audience to parse that out. But it's so much of a pain that this is reverberating around Congress. There was a law passed, almost passed in the last Congress. So voice vote in the House, which means it was bipartisan, and I'm sure will pass. And CMS has obviously heard this. I think everybody knows, but prior auth is really burdensome for providers. They have to provide all kinds of information, and it's really painful. But the real issue to think about here is prior auth is a failure mode in the healthcare system because we can't be smart about allocating care. So we're using these very primitive, don't put your hands in the cookie jar type of allocation schemes for directing care to patients. I will just sort of leave that maybe for another question, but today we can actually calculate on what care makes sense. So the whole premise of prior auth, I think, is going to be shifting totally in the not too distant future. The rule, the specific proposed rule, has two areas of prior auth. One that Eden just mentioned, which I think is absolutely going to happen and is technically relatively straightforward, is you as a payer have to, in each of these three classes of APIs, so each of the three have to report on your prior authorization decision-making, what you approved, what you denied over the last year. And in fact, there's also some requirements in the rule that you have to report that publicly. So this sort of nobody knows what I'm doing kind of stuff. The one little wrinkle on all of that is they don't cover drugs. I've been trying to do a little research into who got to CMS on not covering drugs, because that's probably the biggest single expense here, but it's DC.
Same thought.
It's DC, it's lobbying.
Yeah.
There's a lot of lobbyists, there's a lot of lawyers. The second part of prior auth in the proposed rule is the automation of prior auth.
Yeah.
Right. So what we talked about with the APIs is not really automation. It's exposing data. The data is a document. The other part is this PAR D. Without getting into all of the acronyms, it's basically an early statement that CMS is supporting the the HL7 FHIR Da Vinci initiative, which is starting to automate prior auth. So just think about the components there. So first, if I'm a doc and you're a patient sitting with me, how do we discover whether the thing that I'm about to order is covered by prior auth? Second thing is, what data are they going to need? And the third thing is, what are the mechanisms? So that's, I would say, a work in progress, honestly. And it's a very separate thing, though it sounds the same as the documentation requirements, which are absolutely sort of going to be implemented because that's technically straightforward. So as folks think about prior auth, partition it. My guess is there's actually going to be a separate rule on the prior auth automation.
There'll be a lot to be looking at here as we go forward. Just one other comment on that. Is FHIR integral to how prior auth is going to, roll out in your mind?
Yeah, all the standards they're talking about are being done by the HL7 FHIR work groups.
Yeah.
So there's always a little nuance. And so what hasn't worked historically is for those of folks who are in the electronic data interchange, so the billing world with, the classic clearinghouses, is the prior auth pieces of the X12 standard. So sort of an old XML standard that generates all the medical bills that historically you've had. There's still a hook in there on maybe it needs to be converted to that. I would put that in the to be fixed. CMS has already granted an exception to the people working with Da Vinci on the FHIR data to not use X12, but I think that's one of these, process evolution steps. Yeah, but you can't do any data exchange. Like, why would you provide this? Why does a patient need this service without FHIR?
Yeah, no, it'd be fascinating to your comment about, the doctor and the patient being together and actually knowing what they were prescribing would be covered, or maybe one day even understanding if that's a good care plan. So
yeah, that's another question. Should I even be getting this service?
I know. Well, so Ed, and we change a little bit of the tone here. Talk about this idea of payer to payer. So 2.5 years ago, CMS made, I guess, its first move into this idea that payers need to communicate better with payers. It is sort of interesting, like any of us would think probably could be over the past 5 years, you might have had 3 or 4 payers in your life, right? You start as an employee, and you get changed over, and none of the historical content moves. And so you're starting over every time with a new healthcare relationship. And I think that CMS is starting to push that we need a much better longitudinal view of people's care, and maybe through claims we'll at least have seen that, if not through the medical record. So what do you see happening in this now reinitiation of payer to payer in this next ruling?
Yeah, totally. So I think you touched on something that's really important, which is that, and I think Don, you alluded to it earlier as well, payers are so uniquely situated to be the hub in this hub and spoke model of data sharing. As you mentioned, you have maybe 2, 3, 4 payers across your life cycle, where how many providers could you have, especially if you're someone with a high risk ailment. So I think realistically, the emphasis on payer to payer here is really important, just given the nuance. But I do think some of the core changes we saw over this updated regulation in December are really interesting to point out, because I think they're actually very indicative of the shift in tone that CMS is taking as it pertains to interoperability. So, 2 big areas we saw expansion on is impacted payers and data elements. So originally, payer to payer was just supporting clinical data exchange. We're now seeing that being far more expanded to all 4 of those data elements we referred to earlier. In addition, it really didn't tie to Medicaid and CHIP. It now does. So that's been expanded to include even more payers than before, hopefully increasing more visibility and coordination, especially on the state level. And then I think the other piece of this, that even though it's still an opt-in model, you're actually seeing a lot more requirement on the payer here, a lot more active participation in this process. So originally it was worded as such where, if your member requested you send the data, you have to do it. Now it's more worded along the lines of, you actually have to have an administrative process that's made available at the time of enrollment for any member to identify who their former or concurrent payers are, and for them to actually opt into data sharing. And that's something you're now as a payer mandated to do. So you're actually having to go out and get the consent, which is still opt-in, but it feels more like an active opt-in. It feels a little bit different to patient access in that regard. And so I think what you're seeing for some of these areas is more active requirements. And I noted there was actually a question in the chat around commercial payers. Yeah. And this is an area where you actually are seeing involvement from commercial payers, which I think is really interesting. So essentially a responding payer or a requesting payer now has to take into account commercial payers, in the sense that if a member identifies a payer that is a commercial payer as their former payer, that requesting payer has to go and actually make the request for the same information as they would from any other impacted payer. Similarly speaking, if a responding payer gets a request that's valid, meets the requirements of the regulation from a commercial payer, they also have to respond to that request. So I think some of the things we're seeing here is a lot more active requirements, but I think we're also starting to see a little bit more intersection into the fact that some of these members who are covered under these Medicare or Medicaid plans do have commercial payers that we need to start including as part of this process.
Maybe it would be helpful if you could just comment on your perspective relative to the benefit to the payer when they start to put this infrastructure in place. Having that historical information on a new member is pretty powerful, right?
I mean, it really is, because there's so many processes that are so administrative in nature that could be reduced if you had that information. So for example, I think to Don's point around prior authorization data, that's a huge area where understanding what was approved in the past or why requests were denied in the past. Understanding that information will make you way more effective and allow your workflows to be far more efficient. So, I mean, the benefit is truly, that's just a microcosm example of that.
Yeah, it is, a profound time in the industry. And actually, we should all be excited that someone's triggering us in this direction. And rather than, maybe sometimes, we know what we should do, but we don't do it. And then when we finally do, we actually operate better.
And to add to that, I think what's really great about this new payer-to-payer regulation, because the request is coming from the payer directly, it actually is setting up a process to offer population level data requests. So if you're going out and actively obtaining those consents and have those prescribed to you already, then essentially what you could facilitate is for any payer that you're making requests, you could make requests for multiple members at the same time. So this is, again, another efficiency area where we really could see material improvement.
So this period of time is called the commentary period, where the rule is proposed, the commentary into CMS, we all get that opportunity. And so, it's not like we're only just being told what has to happen, right? We can give some feedback and then a rule will be finalized. And so why don't you tell a little bit about these 5 components where CMS is requiring some feedback on?
Yeah, so I think these areas are probably the most interesting because I think they're harbingers of what is to come in terms of future regulation or just industry trends. So the first 2, I think we're actively already seeing in today's healthcare space, which is essentially a focus on social determinants of health or social risk data elements, and then behavioral health. I think for a very long time, those 2 data elements are so impactful to the person's overall health and well-being, but aren't easily shared today, especially in an electronic format. So we are seeing some requests for, feedback in terms of how we can standardize SDOH data elements, how we can help, affect the electronic sharing of behavioral health data, which again has been an area of information where privacy concerns tend to unfortunately outweigh desire to share information. So I think both of those areas are really going to be impactful in terms of future trends. I think we're all already seeing social determinants of health becoming more relevant. I know California recently instituted a proposed regulation where they're moving to US CDI version 2, where the big differentiator there is additional SDOH related data elements. So I think we're already seeing this. The other area where we're seeing more requests for information in terms of how we can help optimize data exchange is around maternal health. I think that's been a big area in terms of healthcare disparity in the United States. So I think that's an area where we're starting to understand there are certain elements where more information might be relevant and can be more impactful in terms of how we provide care. And then I think the other 2 elements that we're seeing requests for is on the Medicare fee-for-service side of the house. A lot of the times, what we're having is the requesting providers and the supplying providers aren't always the same in terms of that workflow. And what's actually creating a lot of the gaps in care coordination there is the inability between those 2 providers to communicate effectively. So I think this is a really interesting request because I think we're starting to see not only how should payers and providers interact, but how should providers and providers interact in this landscape. So I think that's a really interesting request. And then the last one, unsurprisingly, is how to essentially bridge the gap between the CMS interoperability regulations and ONC's TEPCA. And those requirements, where both of them obviously are interoperability regulations that are promoting organizations to share information for care coordination purposes, but obviously are doing it using 2 different techniques and technologies. So there was a request in terms of how can payers who are already mandated to support these CMS interoperability regulations, how can they essentially be incentivized to participate in TEFCA as well?
So we all know that we would love to have great intent in what we do in life, and we should care about care and risk and quality and the member and patient experience. And one of the ways that we sort of put out into the industry is that if we could use a common data standard, we might have a better chance of getting that done if we can do that and complete and make it interoperable and computable. So FHIR continues to be the center point of making that happen. I don't think that there's really a question anymore whether that's the standard. And so, but organizations who have started moving this direction are probably still thinking, is this here to stay? What should I be doing with FHIR more broadly? Is it just for a narrow use case, or is it really the way that we're going to store it, use and manage and compute on data? And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think there's still a lot of questions from the proposed rule that I think we'll hopefully get more answers on as we get closer and closer to 2026. I think one of the questions that has been very sufficiently answered is that FHIR is here to stay. FHIR is the mechanism that CMS is going to leverage to support their interoperability requirements. And I think, if I was going to advise, participants of this webinar one way or the other, I think the core piece of advice I would give them is that, I think a lot of people probably heard, 2026, okay, this feels like a tomorrow me problem. And there are a couple of issues with that I'd like to call out. First being 2026 is actually not that far away. Time in this kind of industry tends to fly quite quickly because there's always things we have to do. There's never going to be a period without any problems that require energy and effort. So that's the one piece. I think most notably, I think if you're looking at FHIR and these compliance requirements as a problem, you're looking at it wrong. FHIR isn't a problem to solve, it's a solution to take advantage of. And I think if you're not actively thinking of how can I leverage FHIR today to optimize my workflows, to make everything I do more efficient. I mean, if you just think about the value of being able to pull in using FHIR APIs, pull in external data sets, and then using FHIR as a standard, normalize them consistently so that you can actually use it as one holistic data set. Just the value of that action alone in terms of administrative workflows, night and day.
Yep.
So I think at this point in time, it's something you're going to have to do anyway for CMS regulations, but you should be taking advantage of it today because you could ultimately be killing two birds with one stone here. So
we like that. We like that a lot. Don, other industries have sort of solved for data completeness problems. I don't know how American Express would be able to do what they do in terms of fraud detection without the completeness of data from many different data sources. And in healthcare, we tend to just look through our silo. And so this idea of bringing claims and clinical data together, using FHIR as the mechanism, give everyone just a little bit of perspective on how profound that sort of is across so many processes and the implications of that.
Yeah, I think the way to look at interoperability, I think there's sort of two big things, sort of how are we doing interoperability today? What were the trends there? And then the other thing is, what does interoperability in the future look like? It's totally different. So if you look today, there are sort of two broad streams of interoperability, if you will, that are really point-to-point communications. It's sort of a very narrow, not really computed view of interoperability. So one broad stream was sort of early clinical data. So that came from lab analyzers, the HL7 version 2, maybe a next generation was images and DICOM. So straight from the machine to another machine, and, just as results, basically, maybe a little wrapper. On the financial, and that was one whole stream. And for most folks, they'll know that as HL7 V2 or DICOM for the, the images. On the financial side with HIPAA, which is not just privacy, the biggest impact to HIPAA historically, when it started in 1996, was requiring electronic data in exchange for payments.
Yeah.
And so, take your time machine back to 1996 if you were alive and sentient, right? And XML was starting, right? So, just sort of a borning, if you will. I don't know if that's a word, but So what we have in the whole EDI world is X12, right? So this is this whole only in American healthcare where you have these claims and eligibility and 60 days, and then you get the eligibility report back and all of these mailers. If you're a patient, this is not a bill. Like what other industry has this is not a bill as one of their sort of stock and trade activities. All of that X12, as you know, there were many federal work groups that, you know, that frankly, we worked on at ONC, at HITAC, at National Center for Vital Health Statistics. How could we get this together, right? Because everybody's been talking for 20 years on value in healthcare, value-based care. Value-based care is sort of a goof if you don't know what the price is. In our daily lives, value is 100% on how much am I paying for the damn thing. In healthcare, to have the sort of point of view or hope that you're going to analyze value without knowing what something costs is truly odd. Okay, well, okay, so we can all agree on that. How do you actually do it? And for the first time ever, FHIR, because it was built in part by Graham Grieve to address these kind of things, and because it's using the entire modern RESTful web JSON data stack, right? So it's reuse of tools, not just bespoke healthcare things. We finally have eligibility claims resources in FHIR, so we can do in a level homogeneous environment, compute environment, any kind of calculation on cost and quality and outcomes, whether that's prior auth we talked about, whether that's network design, whether it's quality measurement, all of those things now sort of compute. And I would leave the folks with the sense, this is how interoperability in the rest of the world works. They don't really talk. They talked about interoperability at American Express in the 1960s and 70s when they did ATMs. Now it's totally integrated data computation. So I would say, take away, the 1970s, 80s, 90s, maybe 2000, interoperability engines type of approach, and think, how am I going to do compute? Because the interoperability that these APIs are opening up that you've just heard is really going to be totally changed by compute. And what's compute? How do I have a conversation with a patient about what's good for them, what they should do on their cell phone, live, not just at the doctor's visit? How do I unburden the entire provision of care, all the paperwork and forms? Those are ultimately compute things. So I think we're seeing this shift from old school interoperability, which was, we can munge your data for you. I mean, that's what it is. Yeah. That's what it historically has been, to compute. So I think that's the world. And even for things like AI and ML, FHIR, you need a homogeneous data representation if you don't want to have bias everywhere in AI. So FHIR, even, because of its elegance, provides that. So I would throw that out as the sort of tectonic shift here.
Yeah, we all have this moment in time where, sometimes you watch something happen and sometimes you can participate. And I think everyone on this call here today can participate in this transformation. I don't know who wants to use a card catalog versus Google, but that's the way we used to search for information, and that's not okay today. And these rules and the use of FHIR and interoperability allow us to run our businesses better. And just running a business better is nice, but here we change people's health, right? We can have more equity in how health gets delivered. We can have that risk stuff could actually be addressed. The care plan could be better. The cost could be different. Every element of this system, we now have this as the opportunity moment, rather than as this sort of like burden moment. And I think that's what the industry should be thinking about over the next 2 years. Like, we should race to 26, not be sort of intimidated by, oh my God, there's more to do, but rather, how do I make what my mission in healthcare is better? And what do you think about, where we sit with that?
No, I totally agree. And I think Don touched upon this, quite eloquently in his last answer there. But I think we, as a healthcare industry, look at interoperability and equate that to exchange. And as a result of that, we're missing half of the definition, right? Because interoperability is the ability to exchange data from system A to B and then make use of that data.
That's right.
And I think we've been so focused over the last few years on that exchange piece because candidly, it's the easier part of it. And I think it's now time for us to really double down on make use of. And I think what that means in the healthcare space versus the finance space is totally different. And I think in some aspects, it's probably a lot harder and we probably have a lot more work to do. But I think if we were able to harness that the same way they did in those other industries, the impact to healthcare, not only on like just the industry as a whole, but to individuals will be so impactful. Like it's just, night and day. So, I mean, I think about my own personal experiences in the healthcare space and think about how much easier it would have been if my provider knew something about me that my former provider did, right? Like basic information like that. So I think at this point, we have a lot of work to do, but I think at this point we have the tools to do it in, which is a very, very exciting change.
Don, that intersection that you live, by being a provider and, you're in the ER on the weekends and you're working with us on the data elements, must be sort of both frustrating and exciting,
Yeah.
right? That you can see what's possible and, what these rules are doing. I guess this is the start of really getting serious about this, right?
Yeah, folks may or may not know, I've been at this for literally over 40 years. And it's, was involved in building the first Windows electronic medical record and obviously CPOE and things. And I think for the first time now, I thought this was going to happen 10, 20, 30 years before, but, extrapolating for other industries doesn't always work in healthcare, as we sadly know.
Yeah.
But I think all the tools are finally in place. We have the data, we have the compute power, we have the networks, we have the regulatory thing. We're getting the financial incentives on a continuing basis from Congress. So I think all of this is finally coming together, and the reality is it's going to be a little bit of a winner take all type of world, as we've seen in many of these IT realms. If your entity is able to better compute on the provision of care, because Congress is basically shifting the allocation of care from providers to payers. Now, you could argue about that all you want and all the details, but that, as a provider, I say that is sort of what's happening. The folks who are best at computing on that are going to withstand the incredible public scrutiny that's going to come, right? I mean, these rules could also be seen as public scrutiny rules, right? They have reporting requirements, they have transparency. So it's a very, the forces are all coming together. And I know Eden has mentioned, the January 2026. I think the forcing function here is not that date. I think the forcing function is going to be accountability in things like prior auth. That's going to come before that for folks just who aren't part of the rule-making world. Hopefully very few of you are, but I know some of you have lived in that world, and obviously we all have to sort of adjust to it. The way this works is this is what's called a proposed rule. The comment period's open until March 13th. You can just Google, CMS interoperability rule, and you'll get the links in the Federal Register. You can, comment on it if you wish. Then what happens is, and there will probably be thousands of comments on this rule. So then what typically will happen in agencies, again, having lived through this, they actually hire consulting firms to go through, and they go through every single thread of comment, believe it or not. I had written comment letters in my prior life and thought nobody read them. But I can assure you, at least in CMS and ONC, they actually read and process every letter and every point, and they collate them, organize them, and then the folks at CMS, who are great folks like Alex Muggy, Lorraine Dew, very hardworking, truly dedicated public servants, they, with the entire team, well, then synthesize the inputs, try to do the thing that makes the most sense. And then there's a whole only in DC type of process of clearance and departmental clearance and OMB clearance and White House clearance. So you're going to see a final rule somewhere roughly in a year from now. What you will see before that, I believe, are laws on prior auth and prior auth reporting and accountability there. So that's, you know, for folks who like the DC stuff, that's the DC part of this game, but just,
Yeah,
you
that's
know,
good to have that
some
sense.
people may not, you know, maybe boring as hell to some people and
But we don't
sadly
have to
exciting to others. Our legal team here.
Yeah.
We don't have to wait, right? We need to move to FHIR as an industry.
Yeah.
We need to move to the cloud as a mechanism to make this easier. We have to think about all that legacy data and getting into a form that we can compute with and interoperate with. And so we don't need to wait for any rule, right?
Yeah, and that brings up a point. HL7FHIR.org, you can Google it, obviously. They have an incredible number of classes. The FHIR developer community is exploding. The FHIR hackathons are in the hundreds of folks, and they're multiple times a year. They're globally. This is one of the other interesting things about FHIR. Unlike, for example, US X12 payment rules, is FHIR is really a global phenomenon. So, you know, folks, I know it's sort of a new thing maybe for some folks. There's some great ways to start learning about it, and ultimately, even if it sort of gives you a little bit of you know, what is this FHIR stuff? Don't forget, every time you use an app on your smartphone, you're using almost guaranteed an underlying server at the back end of that app communicating in JSON. FHIR is the healthcare version of JSON.
Yeah.
So, you know, it seems like it's alien, but if anybody on the call, which is of course all of us, have used a smartphone today, which is of course all of us, I'm not even sure you could get to this without something like that. You've already used the technical underpinnings. So just to, you know,
to worry about whether it'll work.
Yeah, right.
Work.
Yeah.
You know, and so we've had some people listening in asking some questions. Maybe we'll jump to that before we wrap up. You know, and this idea of endpoint management is going to be a bit of a challenge for payer-to-payer and provider access and prior auth. What do you think? Anything you can suggest?
Yeah, I think, you know, the reality is there are always going to be reasons to not share data, right? And I think some of this endpoint management stuff comes up kind of in the context of privacy laws as well, which is like, how do I know I can still share data with this person? What are the consents? And I think there's going to be, I'm hopeful, there's going to be some more guidance in terms of what that looks like long-term from balancing privacy concerns. I do think realistically that a lot of this is going to have to be based on the information payers maintain today to determine some of that. And that's already addressed in some of the comments where payers are going to be responsible for attribution when they're thinking through their provider networks as part of the provider access API. So I think some of these questions will have to be addressed in terms of some of the administrative work that needs to be done to prepare for these regs, which is again, another great reason why I said 2026, not that far away, because it's not just technical work. There's a bunch of administrative work that needs to happen in the interim. So I think some of this is getting a lot tighter in terms of understanding kind of your current processes today, how you're maintaining your data use agreements, how you're thinking through your relationships, and making sure you have good processes in place for being able to easily attribute members to providers and vice versa. So I think there's definitely some work, but you know, not to sound too on the nose here, there's obviously technology out there that will help make that process much, much easier.
Yeah. So, I mean, just the payer-to-payer endpoints is not a big computer science problem, and CMS essentially has that handled. That's a number on the order of thousands. They're all known to CMS in many ways from Sunday. The provider endpoints actually is part of the Cures Act, and CMS had a big proposed rule that they're now finalizing on a national provider directory that's going to be an update of the sort of NPI UPenn type of world. So And I can guarantee you that's going to have endpoints in it. Endpoint discovery is a sort of a bit of a complicated issue, but there are actually there's a lot of federal work going on in that. So, folks will have all of those endpoints. That's part of it.
Yeah. I think that's going to take a little bit longer, but I love your optimism there.
Well,
There we go.
yeah.
We'll keep that optimistic tone.
Yeah.
I think that there's this question in the chat about, costs of doing this. And I think we need to put that in the context really ultimately of benefits, right? Because is there really a cost if we can deliver care at a lower price with less risk, et cetera?
Yeah. So the cost question, folks ask for certified EHRs, what are the costs? So as a practical matter, the entire ONC rule, we spent most of our time actually allocating costs as a side note. And just to refresh people's memories on that, costs, EMR vendors are allowed to cover costs reasonably incurred, but not monopoly or oligopoly costs. There are very strong provisions there. If you don't follow those, you're information blocking. For providers, right, who have an EHR and can't change it, that part of it, that gives them a lot of protection. For the public, these things are, quote, free. Now, they're of course not free. They're in the rest of the care, as part of a provision of care, as with, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of federal rules. Again, as you look at the APIs, don't look at the API at the edge. Look at the innards, look at the internals of what your organization is doing and how you're representing data, because your real cost is not the API cost. Your real cost is, do I have an internal representation of data that I can use to compete? I mean, that's just the blunt world. If you're doing there, that's the way you should look at this.
And maybe just building off of this, if there's not a certified EHR, any advice? Well,
on the provider side, pretty much everybody has a certified EHR because you can't get paid for Medicare. I think what the question was, a healthcare organization currently uses non-cert technology. Now, there's a lot of technology out there for things that were never under EHR certification. So, OLAP databases, enterprise data warehouses, all kinds of stuff. Again, I think the real way to think about this is, do I have a computable data store? That's, I think, the way to think about this. There's also a question, we have the questions in front of us in case people are wondering, Deus ex machina. Patient-mediated access, that's already happened.
Yep.
That rule was finalized in 2020 and went into effect at the end of last year. That access is for individuals with their apps. It's also, as we mentioned, for the bulk FHIR. Now, the bulk FHIR has a totally different HIPAA thing. It's a batch mode. It's between covered entities and business associate. But payers on the call actually have an ability, if they negotiate with providers, to get a population level data in FHIR, U.S. Core Data for Interoperability, as we speak today.
I do want to call out too, it's important to note that HIPAA also has very strong provisions around an individual's right to access their own data. And I know we talk a lot about access to data from a technological perspective, but I do think it's always important to reiterate that there are privacy laws that do mandate that covered entities make individual information available upon request. So there are already regulatory requirements around that, in addition to some of the technological ones we're seeing as well.
Maybe adding a quick comment on info blocking.
Yeah.
It's sort of a funny thing because you would think we would never need to even comment on that someone would block access to information.
Yeah.
So here we are.
I know. So I think information blocking is a really, really important piece of this interoperability puzzle. And I feel silly even talking about it next to Don here, who played such a huge role in it. So I'll let him share his piece as well. I think it's really important that we think about like the emphasis behind a lot of these regulations and why they're in place. So I do think, when it comes to things like how should people report instances, I see that question there. I believe ONC has mechanisms on their websites where you can submit reports of information blocking. I do want to remind everyone that there aren't currently enforcement penalties in place as it pertains to providers as defined by the regulation. So right now, there are only enforcement penalties for certified health IT and other HINs, if you will, based on the way that's defined. So do you want to call that out? Because obviously it makes it a little bit harder to enforce information blocking without those penalties being in place. But based on what we're hearing, hopefully we'll see some of those be trickling down the pipeline this year. So fingers crossed that we see some improvement there.
All right, maybe just one more question for today's session. Do payers and providers need their own FHIR servers? How does this work, Don? What do you think?
Yeah, you want to, right? This is really, you want to have your own data. You want to control that data. There's the data store and there's the API, right? We've talked today, and the proposed rule is really about the API. The real thought should be, how do I represent my data to compute? In the future should be your real absolute thought here. And we see all of this moving to the FHIR format. It's going to take a while, but you want to have a FHIR storage thing. I'm going to put a plug-in for OneUp Health since they pay me, but and obviously I joined because I think this is actually the right way to go. But seriously, this is the kind of stuff the cloud is good at, because historically, and that's sort of implicit in the question, you've had a server farm, you've had DevOps on site, somebody's managing, the thing you got from maybe Epic or whomever. The world of the future is about really seamless computing out to if you're a payer or vice versa, to patients and providers, with, quantified self devices. We're all wearing digital watches, as it turns out, right? And can check our heart rate and blah, 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 blah. So I think that real world is, and the consumer world has already shown it, it's ubiquitous computing. And so don't think of it as a data store, think of it as how, whether you're a provider or a payer, how am I going to support ubiquitous computing at the lowest cost, the fastest cost? And I think I'll just put a plug in, and we have a bunch of stuff on our website you can look at, and I think we'll send a link, but it's really about the plasticity of the cloud. And of course, that goes absolutely hand in glove with the plasticity of FHIR as a computable representation of data. So I think that's, at least to me, and certainly that was what we assumed and hoped. And everybody who's been involved in FHIR over the last now roughly 12, 13 years, from in all of the standards groups. So, right, this is a large community. I think as members of the FHIR community, that's what we're assuming is going to be one of the transformative things in healthcare, is that ability to finally, after, however long you want to start counting, to make healthcare computably better.
Yeah. Well, it's been fun for me to hang out with two smart people who really understand what's going on in the industry. You rarely get these opportunities in your life to make a really big impact, and to make an impact on a $4 trillion industry with over 300 million people who every day want to just live, a longer, happier, better life, and healthcare matters to doing that. And, the industry revolves around reimbursement, yes, primarily, but these other pushes towards better quality and better care and lower risk and more access matter. They really matter. And we believe that the cloud infrastructure is there waiting for us to go do something. But there's more data in healthcare than in any other industry. We put this to work. We're going to make an impact, and we're happy to play a role in that. But for everyone on the call, we think this is your opportunity to really go at and think of this as your moment to make a difference. It's why we're all in healthcare, and we appreciate you coming along with us for this great ride. We'll take any other questions as follow-up, and we wish you the best of luck on this journey. Thanks.
Thank you.